Second thing is being present, practicing presence. If you're not present, you're not going to be able to sort of clearly navigate the decision-making process of saying yes or no. If you're not actually focused on yourself, you might not make the right decision and say yes to something you actually don't have the bandwidth. I have pretty clear core metrics that I try to strive for. And so I try to like measure against and ask hard questions. That's the other thing. Like,
Hi Cameron, thank you so much for coming today. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here.
Yeah, actually we met last time. We did jazz together at the San Francisco Tech Week.
Oh yes, that was like 3 months ago. Yeah. With the city of Palo Alto.
Yeah, so funny. And then so the reason why I could interview Cameron today is we have mutual friend, Ellie. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you, Ellie. Yep.
So we had dinner yesterday. Anyway, so she really recommended you because you have many background as a founder and also community builders. So I'm super excited to hear your story.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Tell us about yourself. What do you do in San Francisco?
Yeah, so I'm kind of new to San Francisco. I've only been here for about a year, and I came here to build an open source AI community. Right now, AI is pretty much the probably most important technology for the future of humanity. It is going to extend humanity, I think, much further than anything else. And we want to make sure that AI and superintelligence, which doesn't exist yet, but once it does, is owned by the human, and where the person is at the center of it all and not completely controlled by corporate American companies that really have a mandate to maximize shareholder value and prioritize profit over people. So really try to build this community of founders, developers, researchers focused on open source AI.
Thank you so much. Okay. And then you are also having your startup. It's already 4 years. So could you please tell us about it?
Yeah, so I actually technically run 2 organizations. One is a nonprofit, and we are dedicated to teaching people how to program money. And we've been doing this for about 8 years.
8 years?
Yeah, that one's 8 years.
Wow.
But that is a 501c3, so tax-exempt nonprofit in the United States. And we start courses at universities. So think of it like it's a community with a bunch of smaller communities where we help these smaller communities get the resources that they need. So I've seen a lot of really great examples of community growth in technical ecosystems, and then really bad ones. And so we help these teams sort of transition, because a lot of these university students, they graduate. And so once they graduate, we need new leaders to come in and sort of continue the mission on. So I've been doing that, and then I've been working on a blockchain protocol called Near for the last 4 years. Near is a blockchain protocol, and there's a very large foundation that manages a very large treasury. And so I worked on that foundation for about 2 years. And right now I'm focused on Near AI, which is this whole open source AI ecosystem.
Okay, so 4 years ago, it was pandemic time, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about the story. Why did you start?
Yeah, so pandemic was everyone, it was a struggle for most.
Yeah.
I loved it. I thrive on the computer. So and I've actually even going back, it's really weird, but I believe that my background playing World of Warcraft and video games growing up actually played a really big role in my success during COVID, because I was able to easily navigate internet communities much more natively than I think people who were sort of exposed to them, in a shorter period of time. And so, I loved connecting people around the world. This was a really great time where people their values really shined, and people started organizing around certain interests and topics rather than, only being friends or with people in your area. So I was able to connect with people I've never been able to meet otherwise. And so that was really cool. And I think community is really value driven. So right now in the AI space, I kind of break it up as there's the accelerationists who are just innovate as much as you possibly can, and like we're going to build community around pretty niche topics around driving, making the LLMs much faster or bigger, but like a lot of that research is actually happening in very small like research labs, private labs. And so our approach is like, okay, let's open that up. Let's make it so anyone can participate, and actually we will even pay for compute and give people resources to build in a more public, open way. Similar to what you kind of had to do during COVID. In order to find those, people that are most like you, you have to be public. You have to say, hey, this is what I'm building. And I would recommend for founders, if anyone is listening to this and is a founder, one of the best ways to kind of grow your personal brand and the brand of your company is to build in public. Be active on Twitter, be active on LinkedIn, be active on these channels where you just say, hey, this thing might not be the best version of, this like voice model, but at least I ship something and I'm able to sort of find those people who think this is interesting. And if you do that over time, the impact compounds. And so then you're able to find your next investor, your next employee, your next co-founder, your next whoever, if you're able to build in public. So I learned this early and I was able to sort of benefit from it. Yeah.
This is so beautiful story because, many founders or company tend to hide information or their product not open. Because of they want to, exclusive, right? But what you said was be public. So making a product for public openly.
Correct.
Is right now maybe we cannot make revenue, but we could build our trust brand, self-branding, and then after maybe 1 year or 2 years, we could get fund maybe easily.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like the biggest companies today, most of them don't make any money for a very long time, like turn a profit. And the sort of whole business, the model of doing business has changed drastically. It's, especially in Silicon Valley, you go prove that you're able to go get users, prove that you're able to get some sort of network effect, and then VCs a lot of times throw money at you if you're able to solve someone's problem. Now, is that sustainable long term? Probably not. But Uber was this way. I believe Airbnb was this way. OpenAI is this way. Like all the companies, most of the companies that we know today, sort of defined as a big success, are really pumped with artificially inflated valuations based on VCs. What are the VCs really looking for? Obviously, an exit where they're able to make money, but almost to get their interest to begin with, you need to be seen. It's a crowded space out there. You need to be loud. You need to be public. And so if you're able to do that well early on, and then compound that over time, then you'll have people knocking on your door instead of you having to go search for them. And so, and also when it comes to building like consumer applications, it's probably the best approach because now you're getting to talk to your customers, like listen to them. Like the customers are going to tell you what's wrong. And maybe some of those early users or customers become, passionate users and your ambassadors and the people who are actually going to like take your product to the next level. So I cannot stress enough the importance of building in public, specifically in open source. If you're doing, closed source stuff, maybe it's not as valuable, but listening to your customer regardless is critical.
I see. Thank you so much. How did you get your amazing entrepreneurship mindset? From school or from your family or friends?
Yeah, it's my family. So my dad,
Really?
Yeah, he's I'm the black sheep of my family. They're all live in Florida and they all work in the seafood industry.
Seafood industry?
Yeah, like fish and lobster and all the, good stuff from the ocean. And so I grew up with entrepreneurship. My dad's a hustler. So he will literally not speak a single word of Mandarin, but walk into a Chinatown and try to sell them seafood. So I kind of grew up with this, figure around me that really pushed, he didn't push me to do entrepreneurship, but I just saw him do it. And I thought this was sort of the best path. Also, a little bit, I don't love having a boss as part of it. I don't love being told what to do all the time. And so there's a trade-off. Instead of, working a 9 to 5, I would rather work 7 days a week, 13 hours a day, but control my own time. And so It's sort of just my personality, I guess. But also, I give a lot to my dad. So shout out to my dad.
I love that. So kind of a freedom. You want to control your time is your high priority.
Yeah, definitely.
I see. Cool. Okay, let's dive into your community building stories. So I am here from July, and then I attended many events, conference. There are many cool communities. So as a community builder, like 8 years of experience.
Yeah.
So what is the biggest challenge or pain point in general?
Yeah, I'd say it's like finding the first 3 people that really align with your mission and vision. Because if you are able to find that core group, you're going to be able to sort of accelerate exponentially. So aligning those couple first people based on values is probably the most important thing to start. And so with this nonprofit, we start and support a lot of different university clubs. And for university club, there's no way one person's going to be able to do it themselves. And this is the reality. You absolutely need the people around you. So first off, find that first 2-3 people to support you in your mission. You don't need to pay them. They should be doing it out of interest. If they're expecting money, they're not the right people. And then, really just get consistent with the sort of cadence of the community and how often do you meet? What are the channels of communication? What are what are the goals of the community? What's the mission of the community? I'm kind of against this idea of a lot of companies building community. And I know it's kind of a weird concept, but the reason why is because if you're building a company that's shipping a product, the product should speak for itself. So do you watch Netflix?
Yes.
Do you consider yourself part of the Netflix community?
No.
Exactly. So the idea is you just watch Netflix because that's a good product and it's something that you enjoy.
Convenient.
It's convenient. Yeah, it solves a problem, which is you want to be entertained. And so the best products don't need community.
Wow! It's so great word.
But if you're building a product that's sort of pushing against the normal values of society, then you might need a community to uphold those values and get more people aligned with those values. That is a good reason for a community. I see this all the time, specifically in the blockchain and crypto space, where people are just oh, we launched this token or launch this product and we have this big community. I'm so how many of your people will continue using your product if you didn't have to pay them? And if that answer is 0, then your product is worthless. So I would say if you're building community, build it around values, not product. Products can come out of community. A community is a great place to test product, to identify fellow workers, but not a place to sort of it's not the product. It's a channel of growth.
I see. So tell us about your next milestone in the next 1 year, whatever.
Oh, this one's it's a big milestone. So and I'm going to be mainly talking about coordinating a lot of open source AI researchers to train a 1.5 trillion parameter model in a distributed way. That's crazy. OpenAI is doing this in a centralized way. We want to coordinate researchers from around the world and offer them compute and data and comfort and community of fellow researchers to make sure that superintelligence is open source. So we can ensure that everyone has access to it instead of the potential alternative where it's only one company deciding on who gets access. And so, it's a pretty big milestone if we're able to ship that. And my role in this is going to be coordinating and aligning all of these researchers. So it's a big task. It's going to take probably longer than a year. And that's a bit more on the AI side. On my nonprofit side, which is still alive and still working. By the way, I don't do as much for this anymore. I have a team that's incredibly independent and amazing, and so I'm really just I kind of help them make certain decisions, make sure like money is coming in, but they run the show. And my goal here is to grow, increase our membership in Latin America by 2,000 people by the end of 2025, and place some, I'd say about 5% of these people at jobs in Web3. And the reason why is because people in Latin America frequently get overlooked in the crypto space, just because they don't have as much purchasing power a lot of times. But everyone there understands what broken money looks like, because either their country themselves felt hyperinflation, so the value of their currency, withers away, or are suffering from mass migration. Like live in another country and like a bunch of people are moving into that country because of currency issues in their home countries. And so I'm from Miami originally, and a lot of my best friends are Argentinian, are Venezuelan, and they know this problem firsthand. And so if we can actually teach people how to own their own money and the benefits of that, and then get people jobs in that space, that's kind of part of my life goal. So that's a bit, we have AI and we have sort of crypto. They'll all come together at the end, but it's going to take probably another 3 years.
I see. How about private?
So I've been playing guitar for a long time.
Really? You are a musician?
As a personal musician, I'm not a part of a band, but I want to learn a lot of heavy metal. Iron Maiden, Metallica, I just kind of, I've been listening to a lot of them. And so, I want to learn how to shred.
I see. Cool.
What about you?
Me?
Yeah.
Triathlon.
Oh, cool.
Just like a mini short triathlon. But definitely next year I want to do in California.
Oh, you're in a good place for it. California is like one of the homes of triathletes, so you're a good spot.
What I learned from you today is, I learned a lot, but have to have many hats, and then you are managing. Some founders, they have own company, they have own startup. They tend to be asked by other people, "Hey, Cameron, you are a good speaker. Please join our conference. Hey, could you please become our volunteer member of our organization? Could you please many
it's a lot.
Yeah, right? How do you prioritize and how do you say sorry, no?"
That's a fantastic question. So first off is knowing yourself and knowing what you want in this world and understanding your values and principles. So that's my first filter. If I don't align with your values, I will not get involved in your organization. And so being clear and intentional about that is important. Second thing is being present, practicing presence. Meditation, yoga is a great way to do so.
You do?
Yeah. But the reason why I'm saying this is because if you're not present, you're not going to be able to sort of clearly navigate the decision-making process of saying yes or no. If you're not actually focused on yourself, you might not make the right decision and say yes to something you actually don't have the bandwidth or capacity to do. So first thing, know your values, be present so you can make better decisions. And then in that sort of decision-making process is how you're able to sort of say, hey, is this going to actually add value to my core metrics? I have pretty clear core metrics that I try to strive for. And so I try to measure against and ask hard questions. That's the other thing. It's not okay to, you don't be mean. You don't need to be mean about it. But if someone's asking for your time, it is totally justified for you to push back on saying why do you want me to do this? What value do you think I can add to this? Do you think that there's someone else that can add this value? And it's all about how you ask it, of course, but I think it's totally okay to be brutal in time management, and relentlessly prioritize. Because if that's the case, then you're going to focus on the things that drive the most value for you and your organization. So and then also have good mentors and good people around you in the scenarios when you don't know what's right. And it's okay not to know. It's totally okay not to know. But when you don't know, it's important to have the people around you to ask. And if you don't have those people, go find those people. There's good communities out there. If you're struggling to find those people, you're looking in the wrong places. or maybe your values aren't necessarily aligned with the ones that you're looking to attract. And so, I would pretty much, I'd start there. And when someone asks me, like, I look at my calendar, I'd say, like, hey, that's the other thing. Every single day of my life is planned the day before or the week before. So I know exactly what I'm doing every single minute of the day.
Yes.
Which I have time for, like, this is so I can be present in the times in which I'm supposed to be there. So if I'm blocked out for this hour, like, I know nothing else is on my mind. Like, I'm present here. So, like, time management is critical. That's kind of just my system. Oh, and then journaling. We talked a little bit about this before, but I write down again everything I'm doing the day before, and then also just checking in with myself, like, writing my life goals again. I might write them 5 times a month. Might be too often, but it's a reminder, like, checking in, like, why am I doing this, like, why am I here, and if it starts to get misaligned, like, make an edit, change. So hopefully that is good.
Super great advice. I want to say you are sensei, myself.
No, I'm not a sensei. No.
Yeah, so first, knowing myself. Second, be present, like meditation or yoga or journaling. And third, so we could say no, someone like kind of take our people for having a good mentor. So this is important. And then if we cannot find a good mentor, so we had better to go to other place. Correct place. This is your tips. Amazing. Definitely, I'm taking a note today. Thank you so much, Cameron Sensei. It's great wisdom. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, bye.
The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Cameron. 1. Build in public to amplify impact. Cameron emphasized the importance of building in public as a strategy for founders. Sharing progress, even if imperfect, helps attract like-minded individuals, potential investors, and early adopters. This approach fosters community engagement and trust while enabling feedback that shapes product development. 2. Start with 3 core supporters. Building a meaningful community, beginning by identifying 3 key individuals who align with your mission and value. 3 core supporters play critical roles in driving the community's growth and sustaining momentum. Cameron advised that 3 individuals should be intrinsically motivated and passionate about the shared purpose. 3. Prioritization and progress tracking. Knowing your values and yourself, being present, and maintaining clear goals are crucial for managing time and commitment effectively. Cameron suggests using practice like journaling to track progress, refine goals, and staying aligned with personal and organizational objectives by reflecting myself regularly and frequently. You can ensure long-term focus and impact. Thank you so much for watching our podcast today. We hope our story will help your career and future. Okay, bye bye. またね。